May be seated. Shabbat Shalom. So there's something odd and unique about this week's Parashat. You have to really sort of read it closely to know it, and you have to, and I didn't know it until I read this in somebody else's commentary, to be completely honest. But every single parashat in the Torah, from Moses' birth in chapter 2 of Exodus until the very end of the Torah, every parasha mentions Moses' name, except this one. Moses' name is not mentioned in this parasha. It, oddly enough, because almost everything in this parasha is addressed to Moses, right? God is speaking to Moses and giving him the details of the priest's vestments, giving him the details of the sacrifice used to inaugurate the priesthood, so on and so forth, right? Even the first word, or the first important word, so it begins, V'atah Tetzaveh, you will command, right? Who's the you in the you will command? Moses, right? But it never mentioned his name, even though it's all about the rituals which Moses is going to perform, and yet he's never addressed by name. It's always you. Okay, now, you think about that in a few different ways, right? I mean, sometimes, conversation like, and the older I get, the more this happens to me, like, I know this person, but I don't remember their name, right? So I'll call them you, right? But presumably, God remembers Moses' name, right? So that's not it. Okay, so Rabbi Jonathan Sachs reads this parsha in conjunction with an earlier verse in chapter 4 of Exodus. Aaron and Moses are being reunited, and God says to Moses about Aaron, he will be glad to see you. Okay, now, all right, well, they're brothers, right? They've been separated for a long time. So of course, Aaron will be glad to see you, right? But Rabbi Sachs points out that Aaron may not be so glad to see Moses, right? Because at this point, and all through the Exodus and the confrontation with Pharaoh, right? Now remember, who is the older brother? Aaron, right? But who's the leader? Moses, right? And Aaron is simply the spokesman, right? And, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that Kelly and I often discuss, right? Because Kelly's an only child and I have a younger brother, right? And she doesn't really understand this relationship between siblings, right? And, and things are different now, but when Kelly and I first got married, like 20-odd years ago, she, like, your brother is so different from you. Why are you close? And I'm like, because he's my brother, right? If he wasn't my brother, would I choose him as a friend? Probably not, right? And think about, those of you who have siblings, right? If they weren't your sibling, would you choose them as a friend? Right? I don't want you to answer. I just want you to think about it, right? But but there's something about it. But at the same time, you could expect that Aaron would be jealous of Moses, right? I mean, I'm the older brother, right? I mean, why am I just the spokesperson, right? I mean, like if Joe Biden and Karine Jean-Pierre switched roles, I'm not sure that Biden would be that happy about it, right? I mean, the spokesperson is an important role, but it's not like being the leader, right? And yet, rather than be jealous, Aaron is pleased at his brother's role, right? And this is remarkable. I mean, the whole book of Genesis, right? If we were to give it a name that reflected its comments, instead of Genesis, it might be called the Book of Dysfunctional Families. Right? And especially, right, the book of dysfunctional sibling relationships, right? Cain and Abel, right? Very first pair of siblings. Cain and Abel, Cain slays Abel, right? Isaac and Ishmael, right? The younger brother supplanting the older brother, but the older brother's not very happy about it, right? Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, right? And yet, Aaron is not jealous of Moses, he's really happy for him, right? But now we get to the inauguration of the priesthood, and the situation is reversed, right? Moses is called upon to create a form of leadership which he himself will never exercise, right? And it's kind of weird, right? Because, and you see this, I mean, like, if you watch the coronation of King Charles, right? And much as I think that the person who inhabits that role is mediocre in many ways, right? But the phrase King Charles has a certain resonance, right? But, right, he's also the head of the church, right? But who actually puts the crown on his head? The Archbishop of Canterbury, right? Who ranks below him in status, right? So it's a weird thing, but maybe, I mean, they think, and in many ways, they really try and trace that back to the biblical priesthood, right? Moses is a non-Kohen, but he inaugurates the Kohanim, right? And Moses and his descendants are not Kohanim, right? And those of us who are Kohanim, right, we know that we're descended from Aaron, right? Or at least, in theory. But the descendants of Moses, I mean, presumably they're Levim, and I noticed that we had like a plethora of Levim this morning, right? I mean, but do any of you have a family tradition that you're actually descended from Moses? Right? I mean, Moses' family kind of just disappears, right? So the question is, and the challenge is, can Moses be as happy for Aaron as Aaron was for him many, many years ago, right? Now, a couple of questions, right? Why did Moses lose out to Aaron, right? And like if we go back to the beginning of Exodus, why was it necessary for Aaron to be the spokesman for Moses, right? Why couldn't Moses be his own spokesman, and we know he says, I'm heavy of tongue, right? He may have had a speech impediment, but also it was a sort of punishment because when God told Moses to go to Egypt and bring the people out, at first Moses declined, right? Now, question is, why does Moses lose out on the priesthood, right? Why is it Aaron who's chosen and not Moses, right?
If you look back, Moses had a lot of duties
Yeah,
and leadership role. And do they marry with being a priest?
okay, so Moses had a lot of other jobs, right? He had a lot of other leadership duties, and they were important, and could that coexist with being the priest? And that's a really good point. It's a really strong point, because, I mean, in classical Jewish political theory, right, we have a separation of powers, right? There's the civil authority and there's the religious authority, right? And if you look, even in the shul, right, we've got a board, that's the civil authority, right? In theory, right? And I'm the religious authority, right? And there are times, and it doesn't happen that often, right? But there are times that I may have to say, sorry, this is not a decision that the ritual committee gets to make, right? Or this is not a decision that the board gets to make, right? This is a matter of halakha, and I'm the halakhic authority, right? And there are times when people come to me and I say, look, I'm not the executive director of the shul. I'm the rabbi, right? And you're not going to make me also the executive director, right? So there's a lot of wisdom to what Lloyd just said about, can these two roles coexist? And frankly, when we see, religious authority and civil authority mesh, it's a mess, right? I mean, look no further than Alabama, right? And I don't think that, right? I mean, I have to say this, right? For the Chief Justice to write as the reason for his decision that destroying a fetus is an affront, we cannot do that without encountering the wrath of a holy God. That's grounds for impeachment. I mean, you could believe that. You could believe that, but that has no place in a court ruling, right? I mean, it's Alabama, right? So I think he's not likely to be impeached, but he rightly should be. I mean, absolutely. But look what they made a mess, right? I mean, Birmingham was one of the national centers of IVF, right? I mean, the University of Alabama, Birmingham is one of the top med schools, one of the top hospitals in the country, right? And now it's a mess, and now they're all scrambling to try and fix it, right? Because it should never have been that way in the first place. But there are some commentators, and this may bother some people, okay, but it's not me, it's it's commentators, because of Moses' wife. Okay, who is Moses' wife? Zipporah. And who is she?
She's Jethro's daughter.
Right, she's Jethro's daughter, right? So now we of course assume that all of these Israelites who married non-Israelite women, they converted, right? So, but he married a convert, whereas Aaron's wife is from the tribes of Israel. And it actually, in a way, makes sense. I mean, as a Kohen married to a convert, right? If Kelly and I had had our own biological children, they would have been what is known as halalim. That is to say, they're sort of part Kohanim and part not Kohanim, right? So that all of the like disabilities of a Kohen, they have to observe, right? So they should not go to a cemetery except for a first-degree relative funeral, etc. But they don't have the privileges of a Kohen. They can't have the first Aliyah, they can't come up to Duchin, they can't officiate at a Pidyon HaBed. That is the son of a Kohen and a convert, right? So if we assume, which our commentators do assume, right, that the halacha we have today was the halacha 3,500 years ago. So Moses' descendants would be halalim and not eligible to function as Kohanim, right? But at any rate, Moses, up until now, has demonstrated power, right? So now, can he demonstrate what's known as tzimtzum, withdrawal, okay? And this is a Kabbalistic concept, right? And I discussed this a little bit in the class I gave about the Chabad tunnels and the Rebbe and Chabad messianism and all that, right? But according to the Zohar, according to like Lurianic Kabbalah, at the beginning of creation, like when we say below kol haaretz kavodo, the whole earth is full of God, that was literally true, right? In other words, the being, the essence of God took up the whole universe, right? And if the essence of God takes over the whole universe, right, then there's no room for creation, right? Where does earth go? If God is the whole universe, right? So God has to withdraw to make room for creation, right? And as human beings, we sometimes have to do that, right? If you're a teacher and you want your students to excel, right, you have to sometimes even cast them adrift a little, right? I mean, they'll never figure it out for themselves if you're always spoon feeding them the material, right? Your kids are going to learn how to be adults by functioning as adults, right? And sometimes they're going to mess up, right? But, you know, they'll never grow, right? And at a certain point, you know, you have to like kick them out of the nest, right? Because they're never going to grow otherwise, right? So this is a hard thing to do. It's hard for parents, it's hard for teachers, it's hard for supervisors, and it's probably hard for Moses, right? But Moses has to demonstrate this element of tzimtzum, this element of withdrawal, so that Aaron can shine and that Aaron can exercise his role. Shabbat Shalom? Yeah, Lord.
In the early years, did Aaron recognize Moses as his brother, given, I think Miriam knew there was, and, you know, his mother, Jefferson was a nursemaid.
Yeah, presumably he did. Presumably they knew all along that they were brothers.
But he was existing in the house of Pharaoh.
Right, they were raised in different households, but, you know, at least maybe.
In those early years, and we.
Right, no, it's hard to know precisely, hard to know precisely. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of gaps in this. Yeah. All right, so we continue with the cottage before Musaf and the Musaf service. Page 155 in the Shabbat Siddur, 428 in the Kol Siddur, and then the